We are on DAF Mem Zayin Amid Aleph. We had started the Mishnah yesterday, and we had seen some of the Gemara, and we were talking about a process called Chafina. Chafina is where the Kohen Gadol is going to stick his hands into a pan containing incense, and he's going to take out 2 handfuls of incense, and he puts them in a ladle. And that ladle he's going to be carrying with him together with the pan of coals, and he's going to be walking into the Kodesh HaKadoshim that way. Okay? So the Mishnah had said, Chafan melo chafnav v'nosein l'socha kaf hagadol, nosein l'socha kaf. Hagadol lefi gadlo v'hakatan lefi ktano, v'kach ha'isa midasa. So it says that he took 2 handfuls by pulling out the incense, like I just said. He puts it into the ladle, and it all depends on the size of his hands. If he's a big guy, so he's got more incense. If he's a small guy, smaller incense. And then the Mishnah says, "V'kach ha'isa midasa," and that was its measure. What those words mean, the Gemara will clarify momentarily. Kaf b'yom ha'kippurim lamali. So first the question is, why do you need a ladle at all? Because after all, malo chafnav v'hevi amar rachmana. The Torah doesn't talk about a ladle. The Torah says, take 2 handfuls of incense and bring it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So why don't you just take 2 handfuls of incense and carry it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim that way in your hands? Why do you have to put it into a ladle? So the Gemara says, because mishum delo efsher. He says, logistically, how is it going to work? How can you possibly do it that way? Dehechi na'avid. How are you supposed to do it? Na'ayel v'hader na'ayel hava echas amar rachman v'lo shtei havos. Look, you got to get the coals inside, and you got to get the incense inside. So maybe you'll argue, look, my hands are full with incense, so I'll make 2 trips. First I'll bring the coals in, and then I'll go back out and I'll bring the incense in, and I'll put the incense on the coals. That's not going to work, because the Torah says you can only make 1 trip. Vehevi, he shall bring in 1 time. It doesn't say that you're allowed to make 2 trips into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So nishkale lekitoris b'chofnav v'nachte lamachta alav aleol. So maybe the other alternative is as follows. Take your hands full of kitoris. Then take the pan that has coals on it and put it on top of the incense. And you'll carry it in this way. I mean, you're talking about a hot pan of coals. I assume that the incense will insulate the heat, so it won't scald your palms. So fine. But you'll carry it in that way. But then the Gemara says, okay, maybe that's a solution. But kimati hasam echiliyavid. But then what are you supposed to do once you're inside? How are you supposed to get the incense into the pan if you're holding it that way? Nishkale b'shine v'nachte lamachta. He says one possibility is maybe you could grab the handle of the pan with your teeth. You grab it with your teeth, with your mouth, and then that way you'll put the incense into the pan while holding the handle with your mouth. The Gemara says, come on, Hashta lifnei melech basar v'damei nosin came lifnei melech malchi hamalachim hakadosh baruch hu alachas kama v'kama. You would never do that in front of a mortal king. You would never behave that way. Excuse me, your majesty, while I grab this utensil in my mouth. You're not going to do that. So surely in front of the King of Kings, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're not going to do that. So hilkach lo efshar. So therefore there's no other alternative, and you have to therefore put the incense in a ladle, and you'll carry the ladle in one hand, and you'll carry the coals in the other hand. So where taka do we have a precedent to use a ladle? The answer is that when the Nesiim, when the tribal princes brought their gifts, like we just read on Chanukah, kaf achas asara zahav melei ketoris, that they would bring, each tribal prince would bring a ladle full of ketoris. That was made out, that was made out of gold, the ladle. So you see that there is such a precedent for bringing ketoris in a ladle, and so therefore that was what was done over here. Next, he carried the incense coals. He carried the coal pan in his right hand, and he carried the ladle in his left hand. Now, to the Gemara, that seems counterintuitive, because which is the more important hand? It's the right hand. So if the incense is the objective, you would think that you should carry the incense in your right hand. That's why the Gemara asks, Yatziva ba'ara v'giyora b'shmei shemaya, which is a phrase that you find in the Gemara when something is being done in the opposite of the way it should be. This is the way the Gemara phrases it. It says the resident is on the ground and the stranger is in heaven. It's just the opposite. The resident, or the person who's the norm, should be up in heaven. He's the more important. So the ladle of incense is more important than the coals. So the ladle of incense should be in your right hand, and the coal should be in your left hand. Why is it this? Why is it the other way around? The Gemara answers, Zumaruba v'zumu etes, for one simple reason. The coals are heavier than the incense. There's more coals than incense. There's more mass, and therefore you need to use your stronger hand to support the weight of the coals. The Gemara says, "Vavilu bisman sheshneim shavim l'chmais de Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis zuchama v'zutzonenes." Now, sometimes the Kohen Gadol could be such a big guy that his hands are huge, and so in that situation, there's a lot of incense, and therefore it's sometimes possible for the incense to be as heavy as the coals. But the Gemara says, and there was such an example by a big Kohen Gadol whose name was Yishmael ben Kimchis. His hands were huge. But still, says the Gemara, even in that situation, the coals are hot, the incense are cold, and therefore you need more stability and more control when you're carrying something that's hot versus when you're carrying something that's cold. And that's why you need to use your right hand for the coals and your left hand for the ketaras.
What if he were a lefty?
That's a good question. He could be a balmum. I think the Gemara says elsewhere that a lefty is a balmum. Yeah. But I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's what it says. So Amru alav al Rabbi Yishmael ben Kimchis shahiyachofein arba'as kabin v'melo chafnav, that they say about Rabbi Yishmael ben Kimchis, the Kohen Gadol, he was such a big guy that he was able to scoop out 4 kavs of ketores with his hands full. The Tosfos Yeshanim asks the question, I think it's the Tosfos Yeshanim, he says, I don't understand. The container of incense only held 3 kavs. How could he get 4 kavs out of the pan? So I think he says it's low duck. It's an exaggeration. But the point is that he was able to get a lot out.
Is it over? Like I think there's a calculation also on the Gemara that the above it.
Very good. It could be a heaping measure. Very good. So it could be. Very good. Okay. So va'omer kol anoshim zordu v'zered ima ala legag. And he said, all other women accomplished Zered, but my mother's Zered hit the jackpot. It hit the roof. Now, what does the word Zered mean? That's the question. So, Ika da Amri Ba'arsan, some say that the word Zered means a type of hot cereal, like cream of wheat, like a farina. He says, Uchedarabba bar Yonasan da Amar Rabba bar Yonasan Amar Bichiel Arsan Yafil Lechola. Because hot cereal is good for a sick person to keep them healthy. So all other pregnant women, when they want to become healthy, they eat hot cereal. But my mother ate the fortified hot cereal. Hers hot cereal was like the cream of wheat, that was fortified with 8 essential vitamins and iron. Right? It was really, really good, and it made me come out very, very healthy. And so that's why I'm so big and strong. V'ika da amri b'shichva zera. Some say the word zered does not mean hot cereal, but it means semen. And what he was really trying to explain is that the sperm that impregnated my mother was selected very carefully, and that's why I'm so robust and healthy. The word zered therefore comes from the word shechva zera, or it comes from the word selection, I should say. There's 2 psukim, one in Shmuel and one in Tehillim, where David HaMelech is praising God, and he says in one pasuk, he says, "Vatazreini chayil amilchama," that Hashem, you have been tazreini, as a warrior for war. The other pasuk in Tehillim says, "Vate'azereini chayil milchama." So it's an extra letter aleph. So how do you reconcile? What does it mean? Amar David lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ribono Shel Olam Zeirisani v'Zeiraztani. He said to him, Ribono Shel Olam Zeirisani. Rashi says, you have selected me or carefully measured me to determine that I would be the chosen one. And therefore, v'zei raztani, you have made me very, in my character, very quick to act, from the word ziruz, because of your selection of me. And so basically what this means is that that's what Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis was saying, that my mother's, the sperm that went into impregnated my mother was extremely carefully selected, and that's why I'm so healthy. Amru alav al Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis pam echas siper devarim imaravi echad b'shuk v'natizat sinora mipiv al bigadav. So he was the Kohen Gadol, yeah? One year he happened to be speaking to an Arab, and a particle of spittle flew out of the Arab's mouth and went onto his garment. And we know that the spittle of non-Jews is declared, it has the status of a zav, and it makes the person tameh. And so therefore he could not do the avoda that Yom Kippur, and so instead, v'nichnas Yeshevav achiv v'shimesh tachtav. So his brother Yeshevav acted as his understudy, v'rasa iman shnei kohanim gedolim b'yom echad. And what nachas for their mother, that she saw that two of her sons were the Kohen Gadol on the same day.
What is he doing in the shuk when he's supposed to be away from everybody?
It's a great question. It's a great question. You know, because of the political unrest that took place during the Second Temple, we don't know. Maybe the Kohen Gadol was called outside because of some political concern, even on Yom Kippur. Maybe he needed to show fealty to the politicians of the time. V'shuv amru alav al Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis pamechas yatsa v'siper im hegmon echad b'shuk. One day he had to speak to the ruler, to the governor, out in the marketplace. V'natizat sinora mipiv al bigadav. And once again, the governor had some spittle that came out of his mouth and landed on Rabbi Shmuel's garment. V'nichnas Yosef achiv v'shimesh tachtav. And this time it was his brother Yosef who was his understudy. V'rasa iman shnei kohanim gedolim b'yom echad, and the mother who got such nachas was able to see two sons serving on the same day. Tana Rabbanan shiva banim hayu la Kimchis v'kulan shimshu b'kuhuna gedola. Kimchis had 7 sons, and each one of them served as the Kohen Gadol. Now I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that this is a nachas for a mother, but it also sounds a little bit sad, because how could you have 7 Kohanim Gedolim? They must have died. Because otherwise, that's the only way a Kohen Gadol gets replaced.
Keep talking about the nachas of the mother. The article suggests that every year these incidents happen, so that without them dying, she managed to get all 7.
Is that what the art scroll says?
What the source was.
That Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis must have had to speak to for political reasons a lot. And so every time he started off doing the avoda, and then one of his brothers took over in the middle. Okay.
There's a lot of spittle in the world.
Yeah.
What did the mother pay the
Amru la Chachamim ma asis shezachis lekach. So the Chachamim said to her, "What did you do to merit such a privilege that each one of your sons should be the Kohen Gadol?" So Amr lahem miyamai lo ro'u karos beisi kale sari. She said, "Because I never allowed the beams of my house to be exposed to my uncovered hair. I always was very tsanua, I was always very modest. I always covered my hair. Even inside my own home, I had my hair covered, and that was the key to my having blessed children." So Amrullah harbe asukain velo ho'ilu. So they said back to her, a lot of ladies are very modest, and they still don't have children who are so as great as yours. So we accept your answer, but it must be something even more than that. But at least she attributed her nachas, her ability to have these holy children, to her modesty. Tana Rabbanan, bekumtso shelo yasa mida lekometz. So now let's go back to our discussion. First, what we're going to do is we're going to create a connection between the laws of kemitza to the laws of chafina. What is kemitza? Kemitza is when you bring a mincha, you have to take a fistful of flour or frankincense, and you take it in your palm of your hand with these 3 fingers. Okay, and we learn halachas of chafina, which is scooping out with 2 hands the incense on Yom Kippur, from the laws of kemitza. Okay, so now let's see how we're going to discuss it. Shelo yasa mida lekometz. The word bikumtso means that you have to use your fist. You cannot make a measuring cup, even if it's the exact measurement of a fistful. You can only take the fistful of the mincha with your fist itself. You cannot use a measuring cup in its place. Iboyeluhu mahu shiyasa mida lachafina. So now the question is, does the same halacha apply to chafina, which is the 2 handfuls of incense that you take on Yom Kippur? So the question is like this: Hasamu dichsiv bekumtso aval hachad lo kasiv bechafno ela malo chafnav ketoras imim dakalo. So on the one hand, you could say that they're dissimilar because the word is bekumtso in the pasuk by the kemitza. It says dafka you have to use your fist, but by chafina it doesn't say you have to use your hands. It says you can just take 2 hands full, which implies that as long as it's the measurement of 2 hands full, then that's okay. So that's on the one hand, the Gemara says, Odil mayolif milo mikumtso. But on the other hand, we have the word milo that appears both by the kometz and by the chafina. So it says milo kumtso, a fistful, and it says 2 hands full, and so therefore maybe that creates a gezerah shava to tell me that just like you have to use your fist for the kemitza, you have to use your actual hands for the chafina. So Tashma, so listen to this. This brisa says, V'kach ha'isa, or I'm sorry, the Mishnah had said, V'kach ha'isa midasa. This was the measurement. This was the measurement is a little bit vague, but one of the ways that you could interpret it is, my lav she'imratza lasos mida osa. Doesn't that imply that as long as you have the requisite measurement, you don't have to use your hands, you could just use a measuring cup? Isn't that what the Mishnah seems to imply? Lo, hachika amar. No, what it means to suggest is possibly as follows. V'kach hayachozer v'chofna lifnim. V'kach ha'isa midasa means that after you took the 2 handsful and you put it into the ladle, then v'kach ha'isa midasa means that you were required to use your hands again later on, which means the words v'kach ha'isa midasa could be translated as, and this was its measurement, or v'kach ha'isa midasa means, and this was its protocol. So if you translate it as this was its protocol, means that when the Mishnah says you had to use your hands full by putting the incense into the ladle, maybe what it means is that once you get into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you have to take it out of the ladle, put it back in your hands, and only then transfer from your hands directly into the coals. Maybe that's what the words v'kach ha'isa midasa means, nothing to do with the actual amount, but rather having to do with the protocol of transferring it from your hands into the coals. So the Gemara says, well then shamas mina chofen v'chozer v'chofen. Well then, if that's the way you're interpreting the Mishnah, then you can adduce from the Mishnah the answer to the question that we're going to ask in a couple of pages. In a couple of pages, the Gemara is going to ask, was it necessary to transfer from the ladle back into your hands before you put it in the coals? Or was it permitted to transfer directly from the ladle into the coals? The Gemara says, we're not sure. But if you're interpreting this line of v'kach ha'isa midasa as yes, you had to transfer it from the ladle into your hands, so then there shouldn't be a question. The Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Dilma she'imratza lasos mida ose, inami shelo yechser v'shelo yoser. The answer is, says the Gemara, the words v'kach ha'isa midasa are sufficiently ambiguous that we don't know what it means at all. One possibility is that it means you transfer from the ladle into your hands before putting it to the coals. But it could also mean that you could use a measuring cup instead of your hands when you first measure out the guitars. It could also very well mean that it's just telling you that you're not allowed to do more than your hands full or less than your hands full. But the bottom line is we don't know what v'kach ha'isa midasa means. It's ambiguous enough that it can mean any of those 3, and therefore you can't bring a raya to the Mishnah for anything. Okay, so now let's go on. Tanu Rabbanan, the Brisa now says, Melo kumtso. It says you're supposed to take your hands full. Yachol mivoratz. Now this is going back to the laws of kemitza. Remember, taking your fistful for the mincha, for the flour or for the lavona. You might think that even though there are particles of flour that are protruding out of your fist, then that's okay. As you know, if you take a fist and then there's like stuff all sticking out, protruding out, that's also okay. So tamulomar bikumtso. No, it has to only be with your fist. If there's particles, granules that are protruding out of your fist, then those cannot be used. I bikumtso yachal afilu beroshe etzba osav. So you might think that maybe the Torah is telling you to minimize the amount, and therefore you could take just with your fingertips a small amount and not take with your entire fist. So therefore, Talmud Lomar Melom Kumtso Kidekamtsi Inchi. And therefore, the Torah tells you that no, it's got to be a standard fistful. It can't be more than a fistful, and it can't be less than a fistful, just taking with your fingertips. Okay? So, ha'ketzad. So, what are you supposed to do? Chof shalosh etzba'osav al pisas yado. Here's what you do. You cover your 3 fingers over your palm, and then you scoop in the komets. And then you scoop into the flour, and you pull out a fistful. That's what you're supposed to do. Now, uvemachavas uvemarcheshes mochek begodlo milamala uveetzbo ketana milamata v'zuhi avoda kasha shebemikdash. So it says in the Brisa that there are 2 kinds of mincha where when you do the kemitza, you're not dealing with raw flour, but you're instead dealing with a baked cake. And what you have to do is that you have to break up and crumble up the baked cake into crumbs, and then you do the kemitza with the crumbs. But they're big crumbs. They're not like little crumbs. They're big pieces. And so it becomes more difficult to get exactly a fistful when you're dealing with larger particles. So therefore, the Brisa says that when you're dealing with doing a komets on a baked cake, then what you have to do is you have to use your thumb on this side, and you have to use your pinky on this side to scrape off anything that's protruding, to make sure that all that you have is exactly the amount that's underneath your 3 fingers, between your palm and your 3 fingers.
What about your fingernails then, if you're scooping that way?
You can make sure your fingernails are clipped. So although the Kohen Gadol has the thumbnail, but the thumb is not part of the kemitza. So therefore, and it says in the Brisa, "V'zuhi avoda kasha shebemikdash." This is the most difficult type of avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. It requires the most dexterity. So the Gemara says, "Zuhi v'sulo." You mean this is the only difficult avoda in the Beis Hamikdash? V'ha'ika malika, v'ha'ika chafina. What about malika? Malika is the fingernail of the Kohen Gadol that was used to slaughter birds. That was also a very complex, complicated, it was a difficult process. You needed a lot of dexterity, you need a lot of training in order to know how to do it. And what about chafina, which we're going to see later on, the whole process of transferring the incense into the coals and all of this, it's very complicated. You have to practice a lot. So the Gemara says, Elazuhi me avodos kasha shebemikdash. It was one of the most difficult avodas in the Beis Hamikdash. Not the most, but one of the most. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Boy Rabbi Yehoshua ben Uzzah, Bein haBeinayim shemalokum tzomahu. He asked the following question, this rabbi. He said, what would be if there are granules of flour in between your fingers when you do the kemitza? In other words, you got your 3 fingers. In between the 3 fingers, you've got particles of flour. Is that part of the komets, or is it not part of the komets? Is it considered to be shirayim? Is it leftover flour? So the Gemara says, he says, Amar Rav Papa, de gavoy lo tiboylach devare kometsu, de baroy lo tiboylach devare shirayimu. He says, it's definitely the particles that are on the closer to the inside is surely considered to be part of the komets. The particles that are closer to the outside of your hand are surely considered to be outside and are considered to be shirayim. Ki tiboylach de beini mai. The question really is, those particles which are exactly centered in between your fingers, that's really what we don't know. What is their status? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hadar Pashta Rabbi Yeshua ben Uzzah, Bein haBeinayim safek ninu. He answered his own question and he said, it's a safek. We have to treat it as a situation of doubt. We're not sure what it is, and we have to be machmir on both sides. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, Heichi Yavid, what are you supposed to do? Amar Rabbi Chanina, Maktir komets l'chude techila v'hadar bein haBeinayim. What you're supposed to do is separate those particles from the rest of the komets, burn the komets first, and then those particles that are between your fingers, burn them afterwards on the mizbeach. And this way you cover your bases. Why? He says, Di'i amart bein haBeinayim bereisha Dilma shirayim ninu v'havalu shirayim shechasru ben kmitza lahaktara v'omar mar shirayim shechasru ben kmitza lahaktara ein maktirna leinas hakometz. He says, I'll tell you why. He says there's a halacha that if after you do the kmitza, you have your shirayim, you have your leftover flour. If any part of that leftover flour is destroyed before you have a chance to take the kometz, the fistful of flour, and put it on the mizbeach, then you can't put it on the mizbeach anymore. So if we were to allow you to take those particles that are between your fingers and burn them before you burn the kometz, the problem is like this. What if those particles are treated like shirayim? Then it turns out that a portion of the shirayim was destroyed before you burn the kometz on the mizbeach, and it invalidates the kometz. So that's why you have to burn the kometz first, and then only afterwards burn the granules that are between your fingers. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, that you're not making anything better, because ihachi hashtanami ikrikan kol shemimenu leisham areyu baval taktiru. But if your fear is that maybe those granules between your fingers are shirayim, there's a halacha that once you've burned the kometz, there's a prohibition of offering the shirayim on the mizbeach. So even if you offer the granules between your fingers after the kometz, you're still in violation of a Torah law that says you're not allowed to offer anything of a remnant of that flour onto the mizbeach. And if the granules are shirayim, then you're in violation. Amar Reb Yehuda Bered Reb Shimon ben Pazi Demaktulei L'shum Eitzim. So his solution is that's only true that you're in violation is if you offer shirayim for the sake of offering a mincha. But let's say I take shirayim of a mincha and I burn them on the mizbeach with the intention that this should just be additional fuel for the fire, that it should be just like firewood, right? So then the halacha is that it's okay. Rabbi Eliezer, like Rabbi Eliezer says, Detanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer l'reach nichoach yata ma'ale aval atamala l'shum eitzim. Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim have a discussion as follows. What happens if I have two karbanos whose emurim, whose innards that are supposed to be burning on the mizbeach, accidentally get mixed together? And one of those animal karbanos has already gone past its expiration date. So Rabbi Eliezer says you can still burn the two of them together, because you say to yourself, whatever is not supposed to burn on the mizbeach for the sake of a carbon should be burning for the sake of fuel, adding fuel to the fire. And therefore, even if I take a puzzle item that I'm not supposed to be burning, but I have the intention that I'm just adding it as fuel to the fire, then it's okay. So too, if I take my shirayim and I throw it onto the fire, if not for the sake of a mincha, but for the sake of fuel, then it's halachically acceptable. So the Gemara now says, Hanicha l'Rebbe Eliezer, ela l'Rabbanan ma'ika l'meimar. But that's only true according to Rabbi Eliezer, but the Chachamim disagree with him, and they say that no, even if your intention is for fuel, but if it's puzzle for the Mizbeach, you're not allowed to put it on. So how can you take these granules and put them on the Mizbeach? So Amar Rav Mori dekamsi shmeini. The Gemara says, ultimately you're correct. We cannot allow ourselves to enter into that situation where we're going to have a suffix as to what these granules are. And therefore the solution is, don't put yourself in that position to begin with. Use a Kohen with fat fingers. A Kohen who has fat fingers will make sure that no granules will get stuck in between his fingers, because he's got nice fat fingers and he'll be okay. So therefore the Gemara says, Hashta da asis lahachi, Rabbi Eliezer nami lechatchila dekamsi shmeini. Now that you're coming on to this explanation, so then Rabbi Eliezer would agree to that as well. Rabbi Eliezer is not advocating that lechatchila you're allowed to add something that's puzzle to the mizbeach as fuel. He's only saying that when you really get stuck. So too, lechatchila Rabbi Eliezer would also advocate only use kohanim with fat fingers.
The morim are, when they get mixed up, you put them all on together, and then you have in mind that one opinion that then they are
that whatever is not kosher for the mizbeach should be added.
But in this situation, you're putting the granules on separately, so there's no way of saying, well, it's all going on together. And
I mean, it's an interesting distinction that you're making, but the Gemara's feeling is that once it's permitted, it makes no difference whether it's mixed or whether it's isolated by itself. As long as your intention is that it's fuel, it's okay. Okay. Boy Rav Papa, Bein HaBeinayim Shal Melochafnav Mahu. So Rav Papa asked the following question. We've had this discussion up until now when the granules get stuck between your fingers as far as the komets, as far as the fistful of the mincha material. Now what about on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol is taking 2 hands full of ketores. What about the particles that get stuck between your fingers in that scenario? Are they part of the ketores measurement or not? So my komi boyale. So the Gemara says, I don't know why you're asking this as a separate question. I gomar malo mehasam hainuhach. If you learn the Gezerah Shava that connected Ketores to the Malo Chafnav, like we said before, so then whatever applies to the Komets applies to the Chafina. So Rav Papa hachi boile. So the Gemara answers that no. Now, like Rashi speaks out, really Rav Papa is not learning the Gezerah Shava, and therefore he views the Chafina issue as a separate shaila. Malo Chafna vehevi ba'inan veha'ika, o dilma velokach vehevi ba'inan vahaleka. The question that he's asking is as follows. Melo chafnav, the Torah uses the verb vilokach. Vilokach implies, at least according to one way of thinking, it implies that your taking has to be intentional taking. When I scoop something in my hands, then my intention is for the contents of that are in my palms to be in my hands. What gets in between my fingers, or like Alan suggested, under my fingernails, is inadvertent, is unintentional. And so therefore the question is like this. When the Torah says Melo Chafnav, is it that it makes no difference whether whatever is in your hands is intentional or unintentional? Or because the Torah uses the verb Vilokach, does the accumulation of granules in your hand have to be intentional to the exclusion of things that inadvertently get stuck in between your fingers? That's the way that Rav Papa learns the separate question for a chafina. So the Gemara says, we're going to let that sit, we don't have an answer. Amar Rav Papa pshitali. Rav Papa now says, it's clear to me that malo kumtso kidakamsi imchi. Like we've said before, that you have to do a normative kind of fistful as far as the amount that you need. But boy, Rav Papa kamatz berashe etzbaos of mahu. But now Rav Papa asked the question, what happens if you accumulate in your hands a normative amount of flour for the mincha, but the way that you accumulate it in your hand is not the normative way of scooping it, but rather you just stick your fingertips into the flour and you slowly dig upwards so that eventually it accumulates bit by bit into your hands. In other words, instead of scooping it in one fell scoop, you accumulate it bit by bit. That's one question. Milamata l'mayla mahu. My next question is what if you scoop it upside down? Instead of scooping it like this, which I think is the way you're supposed to scoop it, you ended up scooping it with your hands upwards instead of going downwards. That's another question. Minat stadin mahu. What if you do it from the side? Now, it's all of these things, I'm just approximating what the Gemara's question is, because from Rashi it's really not clear to me exactly the protocol, but it sounds like to me that this is what the Gemara is suggesting as the question. What if you hold your hand up like this, or you hold your hand like this and you scoop it going sideways? That's our question. So the Gemara says in all of these cases...
There's no YouTube on that.
There's no YouTube video, sorry. So the Gemara, although there could be, by now there could be. So the Gemara says, we're going to let this sit. Amar Rav Papa pshitali melochafnov kidachamni inshi. Rav Papa now says the same questions we can ask by the chafina. It's clear to me that the amount of incense that you need is the normative amount that people would put when they scoop out 2 handsful. But boy, Rav Papa chafan baroshe etzbaos of mahu. The similar question that he had by the kamitza. What if you slowly accumulate the incense into your hands, by not sticking your hands all the way into the pan, but just sticking your fingertips into the pan and slowly digging upwards so that they slowly accumulate into your hands? Milamata l'mayla mahu. What if you put your hands in not this way, but you put in your hands this way? In other words, upside down. And minatzad mahu, or if you do it from the side and you slowly accumulate it from the side, how would that work? So bizu vizu v'karvan zu eitzel zu mahu. And finally, his question is: normally you're supposed to put both hands in and scoop them together to pull out the incense. What if you take 2 fistfuls and then pull it out and then put your hands together? What will be the halacha then? In all of these cases, the Gemara says Teku. We're going to let that sit. You have a wonderful day.